People tend to become more prejudiced and more discriminatory when under threat. When we act in a more prejudiced way towards somebody, we feel better about ourselves. How do you dress? How do you speak? What is your background? Do you try to hide some accent, certain vernaculars? People who belong to racialized groups, what name do you put down on your resume? Most of us, when we think about the beauty bias, we think about things all going in favor of the people who are the most beautiful. But the research actually shows
we think we know what fairness looks like, but what if the systems we trust are quietly working against us?
As a professor of industrial organizational psychology at the University of Guelph, Dr. Leanne Son Hing has spent her career uncovering a difficult truth. Prejudice, discrimination, and bias aren't just isolated mistakes.
They're embedded in most of the systems we rely on. From hiring decisions to university admissions, her research reveals how inequality quietly shapes outcomes, often in ways we don't realize.
There's research showing that people more negatively evaluate female professors than male professors. I'm not sure that I'm more interested in the person with a 94 average than the person with an 84 average if that person with an 84 average has got more interesting life experiences.
So, what if everything you've been told about success is a lie? In this episode, Dr. Son Hing shatters the myth of meritocracy, uncovers the harsh truth Gen Z are facing, and reveals whether true fairness can really exist in today's workplaces and institutions.
This isn't just another conversation. It's a wake-up call. Are you ready to see what's really happening beneath the surface?
I'm Dr. Lee.
And I'm Emilia.
And welcome to the Enriched Mindset Podcast.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Leanne Son Hing, an industrial organizational professor at the University of Guelph. Dr. Son Hing is leader of the JEDI Lab, which champions justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. Her groundbreaking work tackles critical issues like inequality, social mobility, and systemic factors shaping our educational and professional environments.
So, Leanne, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for letting us invade your space today. I'm going to start off with a workplace riddle, and maybe you can give us an answer. Okay. Why did the Scarecrow win the Employee of the Year award?
I don't know why.
Because he was out standing in the field.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Well, there's so much ground to cover today. Diversity, equity, and social justice feel more important than ever, especially with today's changing cultural landscape. Our audience is going to love your perspective on these issues, but also your journey with psychology, the advice you can offer students and professionals, your thoughts on Gen Z, work-life balance, and resilience.
I guess to kick things off, can you please tell us about your path to becoming an IO psychologist?
Sure. So when I started university, I thought that I was going to do political science and then journalism and become a political journalist. But I went to UBC as a visiting student in my second year, and I couldn't get into any poli-sci courses. And so just by chance, I ended up in a psychology course, as well as a social psychology and sociology course. And I loved them both. And the one course was so cool because even though it was a second-year course, it gave us journal articles to read. And so I discovered that you could investigate these issues, and I saw the tools to investigate them, realized that that was somebody's job, and that was the job that I wanted.
And what is industrial organizational psychology?
I think of it as social psychology applied to the workplace. So it's basically understanding individual differences as well as group interactions and organizational factors like organizational policies or organizational culture, and how that affects people's day-to-day experiences, how it affects their sense of self, their well-being. Work is such an important part of people's lives.
You did your master's and PhD at Waterloo, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what was your experience like there at Waterloo?
Honestly, it was a tough transition to grad school. I didn't feel like I totally belonged, but it was also the most exciting time of my life in terms of my development. So, I could feel my brain exploding, literally, just learning so much. And that part I loved.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us how you got interested in issues related to equity, diversity, social justice? How did that come about?
I think it was in me from a really young age. So I grew up in the 70s. It was all multiculturalism, the first Trudeau. I really wanted to understand how some people could be so full of intractable distinctions between groups, and then other people could have a philosophy where, we're different, but we're equal. And so that's really what got me into it.
Mm-hmm. What's the biggest stereotype or misconception about IO psychology?
That it's just about making money for organizations.
Okay.
Yeah, that one drives me crazy. It is true that there is always a tension between looking out for employee well-being and maximizing productivity, right? I'm sure we all feel it in our own lived experiences. But to me, IO is about both.
I heard in another podcast that you did that you mentioned your interest in the beauty bias. Can you sort of talk a little bit about that?
So that was the very first paper that I read in that social psychology course in my second year that got me thinking that issues that I cared about so much could be studied systematically, and that's what I wanted to do.
Right. And what is it and how does it manifest?
So I think that most of us, when we think about the beauty bias, we think about things all going in favor of the people who are the most beautiful, because that resonates with maybe how we respond to people. But the research actually shows that where the action is from people who are below average looking. So it's really a homely bias.
Where would you draw the line in terms of people going for a job interview, for example? What's your perspective on things like appropriate dress, grooming, things like that? If we're looking at that as employers, are we being biased in an unfair way?
People definitely attend to those things, right? So people have got a sense of what the prototypical employee looks like. And then to the extent that people deviate from that, they're going to have less working in their favor. So as an individual, you can say, like, what game do I want to play, right? You can think about it in terms of how do you dress, but then you can also think about it in terms of how do you speak, right? So what is your background? Do you try to hide some accent that you might have or certain, vernaculars? And then you can also think about, for people who belong to racialized groups, what name do you put down on your resume? Because there's lots of work showing that people with Asian sounding names receive fewer callbacks, even if they have the exact same resume as somebody with a white sounding name. So I had a student and he asked me whether I thought he should whiten his resume. And, there is no clear answer to that, right? And this ties in with social identity theory, but basically you can take an individual mobility approach, right? In which case, trying to move up the ranks, try to increase your probability of getting the job yourself. Whitening your resume would help you, right, to get that callback. Wearing the blazer and the suit is going to help you to look like you fit in, especially in a more formal corporate environment. But let's say you're engaging in code switching. So let's say you're a Black candidate, right? So speaking white is going to help you. Then the question is, though, what do you want to do for your group, right? So you can take an individual strategy approach and try to fit in so that you can maximize your outcomes, or you can take a group identity affirming approach. So not engaging in conforming behaviors, but trying to shift people's perceptions of who belongs and who doesn't. If you try to do it alone, you're going to have no impact, I would say, especially if you are a low status person. So it's an entry level job. People have got much more ability to enact change if they're working as a group, as part of a group, and when you already have the status.
Going back to the idea of blinding the names on a resume, do you think from a hiring point of view, that's something that more companies should instill?
It depends on where the organization is at. So let's say you've got massive underrepresentation of a group. You know that there's bias happening because the people who get through the door are not the same as the qualified candidate pool. So bias is happening somewhere. Then that's a great step. Let's say, on the other hand, the organization has already done quite a bit of work to try to eliminate bias in their processes and in their systems, and they still want to increase diversity. Well, now it's a matter of, if you were to blind resumes, you can't help pick people who belong to marginalized groups because you've taken that off the resume. So I think it really depends on where the organization's at in terms of their strategy.
Have you ever made a decision that was influenced by unconscious bias that you reflected on later, and how did that shape your perspective moving forward?
So I've taken a lot of IATs.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I know what my biases are. So one of my strongest biases is against homeless people. So it's completely at odds with, my own ideology. And I do a lot of work on socioeconomic status and biases based on classism. But how did I figure that out? It's paying attention to my own automatic behaviors. So seeing that I cross the street when there's homeless people, that I clutch my purse when there's homeless people, right? And so having that insight. So homeless people, I don't end up interacting with for my job. So there is no opportunity for that to have an effect. But of course, that's not the only bias that I have. But I think being aware of my biases have helped me to avoid engaging in discriminatory behavior. You know, the trick is like, are you bending over backwards, right? So actually showing favoritism the other way. But I've seen it play out. So for instance, I was on a committee where our job is to evaluate people's job performance. And there was an instance where there was a female candidate being evaluated, and she collaborated a lot with more senior people. And a lot of questions were about whether or not she's truly independent, you know, does she have the right stuff? And so evaluations weren't super positive, and that critical feedback was given back to her. And then later in the meeting, there was a male candidate, also rather junior, who worked with a lot of more senior people, and he was commended on how well he networks and all of the extra training that he's getting and how he's a go-getter. And this is something that I work on, right? And yet in that moment, I didn't have the words. And it was only that night after wrestling with it that I realized what had happened and how uncomfortable I was with it. But to me, it felt like the moment was lost. Now that I'm more senior, I'm pretty sure I would probably email the chair of that committee to say, hey, I think we need to revisit this. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to have somebody on a committee whose job it is to look out for all of those instances. So have an equity person, and that's what they're looking for the whole time, so that things like that don't happen.
Just for our audience, the IAT is the implicit association test,
right.
and that's you find that's a very reliable way of kind of uncovering these biases.
They do a good job of putting a lot of caveats on their website. So I don't think you can take one score and say, okay, this is exactly diagnostic of my level of bias. So they have no bias, slight bias, moderate, strong bias. And so I've done work with the IAT as a predictor in my research, looking at how it predicts both discriminatory behavior as well as attitudes toward diversity initiatives. Effects are weak, but we get them.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit to academia. So we've read that some of your most recent research highlights that lower socioeconomic status people face difficulties pursuing grad school. Can you just elaborate how systemic factors may influence students' acceptances into schools?
Going back to high school, people from low SES backgrounds, teachers and guidance counselors are more likely to track them for a non-academic stream. In terms of who's more likely to apply for university, people whose parents went to university are more likely to apply, and then who gets in. So within the Canadian undergraduate school system, almost all universities simply rank order people by grades, start at the top and then move down. And people from low SES backgrounds tend to have worse grades. Studying or academics or time organization and management skills are probably not being emphasized by parents as much. Maybe they're not paying for tutors. Maybe they're not paying for, extracurricular activities in the summer that would help to advance, their kids. So there is an achievement gap. And then if we take students coming to undergrad, right, if you want to go to grad school, what do you need to do? You need to get involved in a lab. You need to volunteer, and you need to be getting as many connections as possible. People from high SES backgrounds are more likely to A, have that knowledge, but B, also feel comfortable interacting with the professor, right? So people from low SES backgrounds have got more sense of status difference, and they don't feel as comfortable approaching. So there's multiple reasons why you would find it. And the stats show that people from low SES backgrounds are less likely to advance academically.
Throughout the application process, is there any way that we can potentially reduce that bias?
So I think part of it really has to come before the application process, so that students can make sure that they have the experiences that they need. Another big barrier for people from low SES backgrounds, so lots of students work part-time, but some of them are working multiple jobs part-time, or they're even working full-time. It's hard to be able to study to your utmost with such large responsibilities outside of school. So I think need-based scholarships, I would guess that most universities, that the majority of the funding goes to merit-based scholarships, to shift some of that to need-based scholarships. I would say to set aside a certain proportion of incoming positions to people based on their socioeconomic status background. If we're thinking about post-secondary. So, grad school, law school, med school, that sort of thing. I think asking for statements where people have the opportunity to write about how their background has impacted their performance. And many grad school programs do this, ours does, but people need to know because they don't know if I write about this, will this be held against me or is this going to work in my favor?
Yeah.
So to give assurance that it won't be used as a grounds for discrimination, but also to give people the coaching that in writing such statements, they don't want just to highlight the disadvantage that they've experienced. They want to highlight how what they have achieved is even more impressive given the adversity that they've had to face. And even more so than that, how it's helped them to develop special skills, right? So if you think about people's levels of resilience, if you think about people's ability to handle challenge and stress, people from lower SES backgrounds who make it to university have shown that they can deal with all of this. And those are strengths that people need if they go to grad school.
For sure. I guess like in your lab that you take on thesis students, do you sort of employ that strategy or is it based on grades? What's your philosophy?
I've tried different things over the years. What I have learned is that if there is too much of a gap between where student skills are and where they need to be, that it's painful for both them and me. I would never recommend to anybody to select somebody who isn't deserving of a spot because the more the person is going to struggle, then the more negative stereotypes are being reinforced and the more you're challenging that person beyond what they can handle. And that's not good for their well-being. Okay, so with that in mind, for people who do meet the bar, like I really believe in selecting based on potential. Now, grades are important because that shows me how conscientious you are. So what kind of grades do I need somebody to have? So let's say an 84 versus a 94. I'm not sure that I'm more interested in the person with a 94 average than the person with an 84 average if that person with an 84 average has got more interesting life experiences. So that could be that they've, worked multiple part-time jobs. They help to support their family. They've come from a challenged background. Or it could be that they were on a varsity team or that they helped to work for a friend who's doing a startup, right? So I think looking at potential and competence in a broader way than simply grades is important. The other thing that I try to do, again, about that revealing that hidden curriculum is to let people know in advance what I'm looking for. I used to just be quiet about it and see who can figure out that they're supposed to read my papers and ask me good questions about it, right? And then I realized, well, it's probably kids from high SES backgrounds who know that already. And so instead, I make it super explicit and I tell them what conversation I want to be able to have with them on the basis of them reading a paper. So it's like a job sample test. But giving people a little bit of training beforehand. What I always tell my current students is I don't care what your first draft looks like. I care what your second draft looks like. So what's more important to me in selection is somebody who can incorporate feedback than somebody who already knows everything or who thinks they know everything.
It's the coachability aspect.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can comment on what you're seeing, especially in the United States when it comes to DEI. DEI seems to almost have become a pejorative term now. And with the new Trump administration, you're seeing whole government departments cut in DEI, universities cutting DEI, Meta, Amazon deciding to cut these programs. So can you just speak to what you're observing and your perspective on what's happening?
There's theories of history and sociology that, is always like, well, the pendulum is going to swing, right? And so could be looked at through that lens, but people tend to become more prejudiced and more discriminatory when under threat. There's a strong sense of economic threat in our societies these days. Plus, we've got climate change. Like there's a lot of threat out there. It is shown to be, social cognition studies, to be an effective strategy, which is kind of sad about us as humans. But when we act in a more prejudiced way towards somebody, we feel better about ourselves. So to the extent that people think that their outcomes are getting worse and it's because people who don't deserve it are getting ahead of them because of DEI, then of course there's going to be a backlash against it. In terms of organizations moving away from DEI and universities as well, my question would be, are they trying to avoid backlash by just changing the names of things, but continuing to do the work? In which case, I don't care. Right. So what's important is that the work gets done.
Right.
If, on the other hand, what they're doing is saying, okay, forget that, we're not going to worry about discrimination, then that's extremely problematic. And there's a lot of misperception out there that, we've advanced so far that our current day problems is reverse discrimination, right? White men can't catch a break. The need for the work continues. The question is, how can organizations best do it, avoiding backlash? And to me, it really hinges on promoting the fact that this work, regardless of what people call it, is intricately woven with concerns with meritocracy. So if you're engaging in discrimination, you're not hiring the best. If you're engaging in discrimination, you're not promoting the best. And that's just going to hurt your organizational performance. So organizations need to do the work to make sure that they eliminate all forms of discrimination, which is very difficult because often it's built into their systems, and people and organizations don't like engaging in change. But that's the work that needs to continue.
So I guess applying to potentially an organization that is discriminatory and does have these biases, how would you recommend that that's combated?
I think making appeals to them about what it is that they care about. So it is still true that you're going to face lawsuits, and very expensive ones, if you engage in discrimination. Historically, it has been true that when those lawsuits get announced, that share prices go down, right? They may be not appealing to the broadest customer base. So whatever business type arguments you want to make might be the route that is successful. But I think a lot of organizations do truly care about justice and equity and inclusion, and that they fear that maybe things have gone too far, or they fear that labeling things diversity and equity will alienate some of their employees. And so I would argue that they need to frame things in relation to justice, and that if they're continuing to do that work, that's the most important thing. But they also have to not just cater to one audience, right? So I think it's unfair for marginalized group employees to see their organization moving away from these goals. And so the organization has to still continue to show its clear commitments.
A lot of psych self-help focuses on resilience and grit, and in some sense seems anti-DEI in the sense that it sees some of those philosophies as embracing a sense of victimhood. Can you kind of just speak to a more nuanced understanding of these terms?
Okay, so I'll start with resilience. How it was introduced is as a pattern of behavior. So resilience basically means that given challenging circumstances, somebody does better than one would expect. And so the initial research was done on kids from low SES backgrounds who managed to excel at school nonetheless, and looking at how this was possible. And what they found, it was they had one key adult person in their life who gave them support. And so then they started to do the research on, well, what differentiates those kids from others? And they did have better social skills, right? So you could see how both stories get played out there, right? That it's about your social circumstances, but then it's also about the self. In terms of grit, I think that is a very individualized look at resilience. If we go back to that general notion of doing better than expected given challenging circumstances, I think it comes down to what makes people do better, right? And so what makes people do better is having resources. And so there's resources might be personal resources, right? So it might have something to do with your personality, your character, the types of behaviors you engage in. And, so let's say we're taking somebody who's funny, right? So they're going to attract people to them because they're funny. And therefore, people maybe are going to want to give them greater support, and then they've got those social resources. But there's also resources that can be found in terms of the collective, right? So which groups can you tie into and get support from them? So it could be resources in terms of shared identity, right? So this is a group that you respect and now you're a member, and so you can feel good about yourself. But maybe it's much more about problem solving, right? So the group has information that's helpful to you, right? And they can help you to deal with the challenges that you have, or maybe they're even sharing resources. So if you think about within my own group, so my friends are all other female academics. The thing that we don't have is time. And our kids are older now. So my kids are 12 and 15. But when our kids were young, and then somebody was sick, we were all each other's call for when the school calls. Maybe somebody's in class, or maybe he's, doing something important, and they can't go and pick up their kid. And so we really, parented through a collective. So yeah, social resources is another way in which people can deal with challenging circumstances. And then finally, there's resources either at the organizational or at the societal level. So what kind of programs do we have? What kind of resources does the organization give people? How flexible is the work-life family policies, right? Can people do flex time?
You spoke about your kids. I guess they'd be considered Gen Alpha or Gen Z?
I think they're Gen Z.
Gen Z? Okay. Yeah. I mean, Gen Z are facing challenges that you and I didn't growing up. And at the same time, they're perceived as maybe more emotionally fragile, less able to handle stress. Can you just comment on what you've observed in that generation, if that's a true observation, where it comes from?
First thing I'll say is that I'm reticent to engage in stereotyping based on generations. So, back to basic social psychology, we tend to see groups as more homogeneous than they actually are. And we see bigger differences between groups than actually exists. And, if a year distinguishes which generation you're in, how much of a difference really is there between people in those two different years? A lot of research also shows that what we think of as generational effects are actually stage of life developmental effects. So what's going on with this mental health, epidemic that does seem to be hitting young people the hardest? There definitely are challenges that they're facing, but I think biggest difference is around technology. I think different generations have got different threats that they deal with. But kids spend so many hours every single day on their phones, and social media can really have negative effects on a person's self-esteem. But even there's evidence that it's actually not that bad for you, that there's positive outcomes that can be associated with social media. Yeah, I guess I would say that I'm not taking a firm stand on this one.
Okay, fair enough.
Relating to social media, do you think that potentially it may perpetuate some of these issues in the workplace relating to the lack of diversity, a lack of equity?
Yeah, so the issue of echo chambers is a real problem because people, their attitudes can get more polarized because they're only hearing one perspective. And even then, it's probably not the middle of the road perspective, right? So what gets more hits, what gets more followers, more extreme messages.
Right.
So yeah, I definitely can see that.
This is kind of related to social media in a sense, but I did want to talk to you about your perspective on the Rate My Prof website. I've heard you've actually talked about this in your classes. That's pretty brave.
So I don't know why I would do that to myself, but yes, I have. Yeah.
I remember when I was a grad student, there was a mandatory evaluation of the class, and the grad students got evaluated as well. I just remember reading through these with my colleague, and majority were positive, but literally maybe 3 comments were really nasty. We couldn't stop thinking about it for days.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what you learned, and did it ever bother you?
There's research on student evaluations, and some really interesting research. There's research showing that people more negatively evaluate female professors than male professors, but only if they get a poor grade in the course. So you can think about this as motivated use of stereotyping. So if you get a good grade, you want to see your prof as good, regardless of their gender. If you get a bad grade, you want to see your prof as bad. And the stereotype of women's lack of competence is then a stereotype you can use to derogate your female professor. There isn't readily available stereotypes for derogating your male professor, right? They're seen as expert. There's also some really cool research where they have looked at TAs. Let's say the 2 of you are the TAs for the course. So half of them learn that their TA is Emilia and she's a woman. Half of them learn, John and he's a man. So, you're their TA, right? But they think that your name is John, right? You're still their TA, but they think that your name is Emilia. And what they find is that the actual gender of the TA doesn't affect evaluations of the TA, but the perceived gender does. So students who think that their TA is a man give them higher evaluations than if they think their TA is a woman. And that's a relatively recent study on undergrad. So a lot of times undergrads look at studies, they're like, but this is old, right? Or maybe like young people aren't as biased, but no, they still are.
And knowing that, did that help you kind of like
it
come to
gives,
terms with some
yeah,
of these
so
comments?
it does give me like a little bit of a shield.
Yeah.
I get lots of positive
Yeah.
feedback from students, and some of it is constructive because it tells me what to keep doing.
Yeah.
Then I get negative feedback that's also constructive, right?
Yeah.
So I've been told many times in my early years, please don't speed up at the end of lecture. Like, we can see that you want to get your lecture done, but it doesn't
Yeah.
help us. And so I had to hear it a few times, and then I learned, and I've stopped doing it. I don't get that feedback anymore.
Yeah.
But then I do get some very negative feedback that's not constructive in any way, shape, or
Mhm.
form. And that's the stuff that really hurts. When you feel like you're being read wrong and your
Yeah.
intentions are being read so wrong, it's hard, because what I really want to do is help students with their development,
Mhm.
and ideally, on top of that, make them feel more self-efficacious, right? So
Right.
they see that they're learning and growing, and then they feel good about themselves.
Yeah.
So when I get the feedback that they think that I'm trying to tear them down, that really hurts, because
Yeah.
it's so opposite of what I'm trying to do.
If you have a student who wants to have a great career in psychology, what do you see are the main traits?
Number one thing is a
Mhm.
growth mindset.
Okay.
So it ties into the conversation we're just having. You know, the students who evaluate me so negatively, I think they're students who got some kind of negative feedback from me,
Right.
and they've externalized it. Especially when you start the honors thesis, and then certainly in grad school, you're getting feedback like you never got before, right? So
Right.
years 1 through 3, you submit your paper, you get a number, and that's about it. Like maybe a few light comments from TAs.
Mhm.
But grad school, it's very different, right? Because it's draft after draft after draft.
Right.
And as I said, when I got to grad school, it was like all of a sudden my mind was exploding because I was learning so much. Just the bar is set so much higher. So that's challenging. Growth is challenging. Feedback is challenging.
Yeah.
And so what are you going to do with it? The people who think I'm as good as I'm ever going to be,
Mhm.
and this critical feedback is a huge threat to myself, they're not going to want to accept the feedback, and then they're not going to incorporate it, and then
Mhm.
they're not going to
Right.
improve, and then they just get more and more negative feedback.
Yeah.
The students who are able to manage their emotions and then try it and keep their ears open so that they
Mhm.
can hear the feedback and understand the feedback, do their best to incorporate it, but then also have open communication with their supervisor. Like,
Yeah.
I tried to do this, but I didn't quite get it. Could you explain more? And feel comfortable asking those questions.
Yeah.
Then they can incorporate the feedback, they can get better, and then they'll feel that sense of confidence and efficacy growing, and they'll perform well. So maybe you don't know at first, right? But to just have some kind of glimmer of hope that the feedback is there to help you and that you can improve on the basis of it. And then I'd say that the other thing that's kind of implicit in what I've been saying is for them to have some sense of the benevolence of the other person, knowing that the feedback's coming from a good place to help
Yeah.
them.
What advice would you sort of give to psychology students who are wishing to go into grad school?
Unfortunately, it is a real numbers game. So
Mhm.
people are looking at those grades. But as I said, in my lab, that's not the only thing I'm looking at. A lot of people, what they care about beyond grades is fit. So for instance, if somebody says that they want to work with me and they really care about DEI, then I'm looking at the courses that they've taken, as well as the jobs they've had and the volunteer experience that they've had. And if everything has been like mental health, then I know that IO is really their backup. What they want is clinical, and they're being strategic. And so
Mhm.
then I'm not as interested in those students, even if they have the higher average, because I want somebody who really does
Yeah.
have a clear interest in doing this work.
Yeah.
I just had this conversation with a student in my lab yesterday. He was saying that he wished he had a 94 average. And I said, no, I don't think you do. He's got a high average.
Mhm.
And he said, why? So we start every lab meeting with doing our rose and thorns. And I said, because I've listened to you during the rose and thorns, and your thorn is always that you're not having enough time for friends and family. And then your rose is if you manage to make that time. Knowing what you need to nourish yourself, as well as build out that more complete survey. So it can't just be school. You've got to take care of your social needs, take care of your well-being, and then pursue other interests that you have.
I just want to switch gears
Mhm.
here. At Enriched Mindset, we're interested in financial psychology, psychology of money. I have another little riddle. What do you call a psychologist with a huge student loan balance?
Everyone.
Okay. Well, the answer is an IO psychologist.
I don't
IO.
even get it.
IOOWE.
Oh,
Okay. Well, that didn't land well, but okay. Anyway, many students are really interested in the financial aspects of different career paths. You did mention IO psychology as being one that can actually make quite a lot of money. Was that something that played a factor in choosing your field?
When I picked psychology as my major, my dad's response was, "What are you going to do with that?" And I didn't have much of an answer until I found IO. And then I said to him, like, look, there's lots of jobs that you can get with IO. And then that satisfied him. So the other reason why I was interested in IO is I didn't know if I had it in me to do a PhD. I didn't know if I was smart enough, if I was good enough, if I had the tenacity. And so I thought, well, you can get a good job with a master's. So just in case I don't have the PhD in me, I knew I wanted to be a professor, but I just didn't know like how feasible that was. But the major thing that drew me, other than like the nature of the work, was the job stability. I grew up with a lot of financial instability, and the idea of having a job where it was like I'd have to do something pretty egregious to get fired was really appealing to me. Money obviously is not that big a motivator for me because I picked the lowest paying job for somebody with a PhD in IO.
In IO.
Yeah.
What is your stance on the relationship between money and happiness?
So there's lots of research on this. So basically, up to like $35,000 a year, the more money, the more happiness, right? So if you're really struggling, like increasing people's resources even a little is going to have a big effect.
Yeah.
But once people are making a decent amount of money, it doesn't improve their happiness, right? It's called the hedonic treadmill. Yeah. So, you know, if you're feeling bad, let's say you're stressed out and you want to distract yourself and you engage in some online shopping, you feel good right in the moment. Maybe you feel good right when you open your package, but it goes away, right? It's not like that object continues to give you satisfaction. Where does a sense of happiness really come from? Happiness comes more from in the moment joy. And so what's going to give you in the moment joy, spending time with family and friends, laughter, that sort of thing. But a more important way to look at well-being is what they call eudaimonic well-being. And so that's things around like having a sense of purpose. And that doesn't come from money, right? It comes from feeling like you're doing important things that are going to have positive impact, either on the world or on others.
As we wrap up, can you tell us about some of your recent work and how people can get involved?
I've got my JEDI website, and in there I've got my lab coordinator's email address. And if anybody wants to join my lab, what materials they should send along. In terms of recent work, so, you know, my general umbrella is social justice issues, but then I let students have some latitude based on what their passions and interests are. I recently did an honors thesis project that we need to work on writing up with firefighters. And so we were looking at the stresses that they experience. And so typically when people would think about firefighter stress, you're thinking about them running into burning buildings. It turns out that one of the biggest stressors that they experience is all of the politics and the rumor mill, because this is a job where if we're a crew, my life depends on whether or not you are competent and trustworthy. And so it's all about those perceptions of competence and trustworthiness. And then group status really comes into play because those who are visible minorities and women, they're coming from a real deficit. People are making assumptions about whether or not they're going to be any good at their job. Another current project, a student's really interested in working with people who have a criminal background and the bias that they experience in trying to get a job. And so we're looking at developing interventions that educate people about what good employees people with a criminal background actually are. So they have higher organizational commitment, they're less likely to turn over, their job performance is just as good as others, they're not any more likely to engage in violent acts in the workplace or vandalism or anything like that, to see whether or not that might increase people's likelihood of saying that they would be a good hire. People assume that what leads somebody to engage in criminal behaviors, there's something inherently wrong in that person. If instead what we do is we teach them about the structural causes of engaging in crime, like poverty, peer influence, neighborhood influence, lack of education, do then people make different assumptions about what kind of employee this person might be if they've shown that they've put effort in. The paper I'm working on right now that is due tomorrow, we're looking at people's reactions to pay dispersion in the workplace. So who gets really upset about big gaps between average employee and CEO salaries, which the difference is just skyrocketed in the last 20 years. So people know this, but I don't think they actually have a good sense of the magnitude of the effect. So if you're looking at top like 250 publicly traded corporations in the US, how much typical pay dispersion there is between the average worker and the CEO. The CEO earns by 11 a.m. in a single day what their average employee is going to earn all year long.
Wow.
That's how massive the pay discrepancy is. And so we're looking at how people's understandings of meritocracy influence how they view pay dispersion.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Leanne. And to our listeners, we'll see you on our next episode of the Enriched Mindset Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.